Welcome to this evening conversation with two very special guests, and we will hope to discuss a very important issue this evening. We'll try and bring all of you into this conversation. So let me welcome all those who have joined us on Zoom, those who are joining us on Twitter, those who have tuned into Facebook, and those who are following our YouTube channel. Do send in your questions as the debate and conversation progresses. And I promise not to take more than 15 to 20 minutes in my interrogation of these two very fine minds. And thereafter, I will be just the moderator who will bring your questions to them. So let me welcome Mr. Panda, who's been a distinguished parliamentarian. He has, of course, been someone who has keenly followed and shaped India's digital journey. He's been someone who's been talking about personal data protection, privacy laws and regulation, the management of platforms and the digital economy for long. Those who've been following this debate know him to be someone who minces no words. Let me also welcome my very special friend, a colleague, and someone I admire, Marietje Schaake, a former parliamentarian from the European Parliament, who is now crossed the pond and is leading two programs at Stanford. She's the president of the Cyber Peace Institute, something that is seeking to create a safer and more secure and trustworthy digital future. We are going to talk to them about the digital wars that seem to be unfolding. I'm being a little dramatic, but I think there is some merit here. So first, let me welcome both of you, and let me put the first question to both of you. The first question, of course, is that along with the pandemic, we are facing an infodemic. There are challenges in terms of the veracity of information being put out. There are fake news, there is misinformation, there is malign information, there is an undermining of regimes, there is an exaggeration by regimes. We are seeing an infodemic accompany the pandemic, and people are struggling to know fact and fiction, truth from lies. And more recently, we saw one of the platforms take the bold move and grey flag the President of the United States. Twitter grey flagged Donald Trump. Facebook let his content up. Who was right? Let me turn to you, Marietje.
Well, I've always argued that tech companies should respect the law and the rule of law just like everyone else should. And I think it is up to democratically elected lawmakers to make sure that that actually happens, that laws are updated, and that the rule of law is not disrupted by technological revolutions. Now, because that has not happened yet, I do believe that the very powerful tech platforms like Twitter, but also others like YouTube or Facebook, are perfectly capable and should take their own responsibility to make sure that they create community standards that are in line with values and principles that are crucial in a democracy and crucial for the quality of life for people. So I do believe that Twitter had, first and foremost, all the liberty to do what it did, and I do think it acted responsibly. So I welcomed that ownership of its own power and the possibility to set some standards on its platform.
Okay, I'm going to quiz you a bit more on that position, but let me first turn to Jay. Jay, Twitter grey flagging sovereign. How does that sound to you, since you've been a part of the parliamentary process in a rather boisterous and loud democracy? How would it feel if the opposition party leader or the head of an Indian state was grey flagged by a platform?
So I want to preface this by saying that, of course, this battle has been a while coming and it has been building up. It was obvious that it would come to a clash at some point. Now, there are a couple of things. I have a little disagreement with Marietje here, because when you talk of community standards, they vary over communities. And here you're talking about pan-global platforms. So, different communities will have different standards in India or Brazil or even between coastal America and Midwest America. So this brings into question that what standards should apply. This is really a fight about power and dominance. And the polarization that has been building up was bound to lead to this. So let me flag two things that I find problematic with what Twitter is doing. And the problem is that they haven't applied the same standards to other people. They have not flagged, for instance, leaders of terrorist organizations who have tweeted. They have not flagged certain other authoritarian figures who have tweeted. So this brings into question whether the standards are fair, whether they are uniform, and whether they can be applied at all. Because Twitter now has started making comments that they will take a different approach to world leaders as opposed to ordinary people. Now, is that a fair standard to apply? I'm sure many people will find problems with that. I want to end my initial comments by saying the following, that rules change when entities become really large. Now, the Section 230 was set up to encourage small firms online. Now, when you become really large, then you've seen in the past the application of federal laws in different countries to ensure that they don't have too much power, whether it was breaking up large companies who have monopolies, or whether when we had net neutrality, for instance, the whole idea was telecoms and cable companies should not be able to dictate what you see on a priority basis. So we will have to find answers, and I'm not sure Twitter will be able to do what it does and claim that it is fair and applies a transparent standard.
Marietje, let me turn this back to you. I was asking one of my fellow panelists a few days ago in another conversation that in a very heated Indian political campaign, if Twitter was to grey flag the head of the opposition's comment made on a public platform, there would be charges that the media company is siding with the incumbent, it is bowing down to pressure from the ruling establishment, and there would be a whole hue and cry around Twitter action. How do you ensure that you are able to manage two aspects to this? One, that you are able to keep platforms outside of political conversations, and two, and most importantly, it is not seen as external interference. End of the day, Twitter is an American company. If it was to intervene in Brazil like it did, or in other platforms like it has, other countries like it has, how will that be managed from a sovereign perspective?
Who's the question for?
That's for you, Marietje. How does Twitter navigate these different sovereign boundaries? Interfering in Indian political conversations might be external interference. This is what we have tried to keep our, the sanctity of elections.
Well, I think the question is obviously according to which standards and criteria does a platform flag or demote or label certain tweets. And I think Mr. Panda is absolutely right in the sense that Twitter has evolved its thinking. And so what has not been flagged 1 month ago or even a couple of weeks ago is being flagged now. And COVID-19 has been a game changer for almost every platform. They have all, from YouTube to Facebook to Google to Twitter, gone much further than they have before in labeling information that could be dangerous for public health, where they didn't for other types of content, like misleading information about elections or even hatred, incitement, or other kinds of harmful content. So I believe we are eyewitness to a evolving kind of governance debate within these private platforms. And I believe that if they have their own criteria and they apply them equally, then it goes way too far to say that this is foreign interference. Now, for Twitter to understand the consequences of its labeling and the consequences of speech in other jurisdictions, they, of course, need knowledge about these societies. And I think that a lot of these tech companies, Facebook famously in Myanmar, have failed to invest the resources in these different markets and have therefore failed to understand the implications of their policies in very different contexts. So I think that the difference between politicians, though, and sort of ordinary citizens or much less famous voices is that politicians, whether it's the president of Brazil or India or the United States, they have multiple outlets. If they are not heard in one platform or one of their tweets may not be immediately accessible or flagged, I mean, they were not censored, they still have a multitude of different platforms. Where it gets more tricky is when people are completely silenced or censored, if it is for political reasons, and if these people don't have alternative outlets. So I think it's important to see the proportionality and the impact of each of these steps for what they are, and I would not label it as foreign interference.
Okay, so I think what you are, you suggest that this is perhaps a move in the right direction, except you argue that companies have to invest in building local contexts, capabilities, and to understand the communities they serve, so that they are able to bring policies that are contextual to societies.
Well, yes, but I have said, and I will underline again, that I believe it is the duty of democratic lawmakers to make sure that laws apply online as they do offline. So I would rather not see private companies setting the rules for speech. And I would rather see governments pecking their laws and companies pecking their terms of use to universal human rights law.
Okay.
No, actually universal human rights law.
Which all of us find.
Yeah, so I think that's the direction I would like to see. Now, I don't think that's likely in the near future, but I think that the avoiding of taking responsibility by these big tech platforms is over. They will be held to account, and it was high time that they were.
I want to ask both of you, and I'm going to allow Mr. Panda to respond to this, but let me ask another question that flows from what Marietje, you just mentioned. You mentioned censorship, you mentioned the complete absence of agency to speak up. That reminds me of a country called China, right to the north of India. What we are again seeing here is that the Chinese who do not allow Twitter in their geography now seem to be running a whole propaganda campaign on platforms of free societies. Is there something that can be done to either tell the Chinese to open up their public sphere to everyone as we have opened up our public sphere to them, or in some sense to take note of some of these propaganda and malicious wolf warrior diplomacy tactics that are now on full display in the liberal world's platforms? Mr. Panda, you want to come in on that?
Well, you can try telling the Chinese to behave by global rules, and I'll tell you good luck. And now, I agree partly with what Marietje just said, in that these big tech platforms will have to, and governments, democratically elected governments will have to define the landscape of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. It shouldn't be in the hands of private companies. Now, where I slightly disagree with her is that when you become very large, then it's not okay to say that you have alternate platforms. You can say that about tiny platforms and you have alternates. Now, really today, platforms like Google, for instance, it's very hard for somebody to do without Google Maps or Facebook or Twitter for that, in that sense. And that's why I use the example of antitrust laws in the past, of utilities, of breaking up that dominance and that power. So I've always believed that if you're a tiny startup, you can have a different standard. It doesn't really matter much. You have many alternate platforms. But if you're a global straddling entity, then you do come under the ability to influence what people get to see, what people don't get to see. One last point I want to make. Now, the reality is that freedom of speech laws will be different in all countries, including different democracies. Now, the gold standard used to be in the US that you have freedom of speech until and unless there is an imminent threat to breakdown of law and order. Now, that has evolved over the last 2 decades or so, where what is totally off limits is something like child porn or sex trafficking. And you'll see you have laws today in other countries, including Germany, including Australia. Now, UK is proposing to come up with similar laws for online content restraints. But when it comes to other aspects, when it comes to politics, when it comes to your views on terrorism, if these big platforms get into the business of curating or editing or somehow changing that content, then to say that they're just a platform and they're not responsible doesn't hold water anymore. And the same standards have to apply to them as used to apply to newspapers in the past. Let me remind you, under every op-ed column, there used to be a disclaimer saying that this is the writer's own opinion, this is not our opinion. So if you edit content, you have to be responsible for it. If you don't edit content, you can say that this is not my opinion, I'm just providing a platform for everybody.
Marietje, you want to come in on both how do we manage the Chinese propaganda on liberal platforms, and how do you look at the new platforms as perhaps media houses or media companies, which are in sense curating and editing information?
Well, I think what is crucial is transparency and the ability for independent research and independent oversight over what is happening in terms of information flows, but also the architecture of these platforms, because the sort of ability and the scale of influence campaigns, whether they come from Russia or China or from commercially motivated individuals, is really hard to gauge without a look under the hood of what is happening with these tech companies. Let me give you an example. There was a petition done by the Center for Democracy and Technology asking tech platforms to retain the data sets for later research when it came to their handling of dis and misinformation around COVID-19. And so there is no guaranteed access to such data and no guaranteed ability for researchers in academic institutions, for example, to understand the impact of decisions that have been made. Now, I think that's pretty serious and it should be improved because that independent research is essential. And the same goes for independent oversight. Mm-hmm. So my sense is we don't know enough yet. And it is hard to have evidence-based policies on, for example, how to push back against disinformation on platforms in liberal democracies if we don't even know exactly what is coming from where, whether it is caused by the commercially driven algorithms, by foreign actors, by people's own choices. Like, you know, my neighbor might actually be a big fan of Xi Jinping, and that's a freedom in this country. So we need to understand better what is sort of coordinated, what is authentic or inauthentic behavior, and what is foreign interference in public debate and even elections, as we've seen. Today, there was an interesting example in the case of Zoom, you know, the video platform that we are using now and that many of us have become familiar with, where Zoom in the United States took down the account of a meeting of, let's say, opposition individuals in the United States, and they cited respect for local law, but the local law in this context was Chinese law. So we are seeing really interesting challenges with regard to jurisdiction and rules and regulations on private platforms that I think will only push in the direction of an articulation of where a company stands and what laws it seeks to adhere to. So I'm hoping that this discussion will evolve and that companies will be more transparent and therefore accountable for the choices that they make so that consumers have a choice. I'm frankly extremely uncomfortable and upset about the fact that Zoom has done this. But at the same time, the university where I work has chosen this as the video conferencing platform of choice. So there's a lot of tension between you know, how we can sort of vote with our feet and move to another platform. This also invokes antitrust necessities, as Mr. Panda has mentioned, so that there is actual competition. But only when there's transparency do we know what choices we have and can we hold platforms to account.
Mr. Panda, are we being unfair to tech platforms? To be honest, even without social media, President Trump's statements would have made front page news, would have been criticized. You can see Senator Cotton's op-ed is being much debated. People have questioned whether it should be put up there at all. I mean, are we just singling out tech platforms because it's available to all of us all the time? But in reality, the conversation is being sought to be curated by a certain political section of the global elites. Let's put it this way. So do we see a larger phenomena beyond just the platform?
No, I think tech platforms have known for some time, it's been at least 3 or 4 years, that there have been op-eds and editorials that perhaps the big seven need to be broken up because of the power and dominance that they have. And this is the crux of the issue. Now, you'll find a lot of arguments about who they are unfair to. Sometimes the people on the left say that they are not being treated fairly. Very often you'll find people on the right. In India, there are many people center of right who accuse these same platforms of shadow banning them, of switching them off, turning them off. Now, I think it's relevant if you look at the current issue of The Economist. And the current issue of The Economist has covered this exact dispute and has covered Twitter and Facebook and has made an analysis that should come as no surprise to anybody, that the large majority of the employees of these platforms are left affiliated. And now this should not come as a surprise. It's well known, but it's getting more and more validation from credible sources like The Economist. Now, the fact is, if you start imposing ideologies on getting the message out. You referred to the Tom Cotton op-ed. Now, look, in the past, the New York Times had a little left of center own sort of stand, but you could see all kinds of opinions in its op-ed pages. And today, look, if they applied the same standards, then they could even make a case for it. But if they have op-eds by, as I said earlier, by terrorist leaders and by authoritarian leaders, and you say that a senator of the governing party of the country where you operate is not a valid voice, then obviously people are going to question you on your transparency and your standards. And how can you, even if you wanted to, could you apply those standards? Because one point has been made that platforms, whether they are Twitter or Facebook, they have thousands of so-called fact checkers, but that's not enough because they have billions of users. So they would actually need millions of fact checkers to do a fair job to maintaining those standards. So it's not going to be easy, and it should have come as no surprise, as I've been saying.
Marietje, to both of you, but let me start with you. How do you see the relationship of society and of people change with technology post this pandemic? Is public health and the fear of the pandemic creating a new normal where, in some sense, the creep by the state, be it surveillance, be it censorship, be it control of flows, call it what you like. I'm not going to go into the semantics of describing the new normal. But do you think that this texture of individual and technology relationship is changing forever? And do you think that people like you, like both of you who are keen followers of digital regulation and digital societies, need to be thinking about what can be done to ensure that the emancipatory potential of technology is retained?
So I think the relationship between people and technology is changing in profound ways. And let me mention 3 examples. One is the role that technology plays in people's lives. It's become normalized and solidified in this crisis. I mean, we all depend on being connected for work, for school, for news, for entertainment, basically for everything that we do. And the same goes for children. That's the second point I wanted to mention. I think it's been really challenging for parents who have tried to put limits to screen use in place for their children, and now have to acknowledge that the only way in which children can go to school is online. It will be really hard to roll that back. And thirdly is the entering into the health data and health information space by these platforms. Health data, for very legitimate and good reasons, has been protected with higher thresholds, more standards. The doctor-patient relation is always one of great confidentiality to protect people and to ensure that this data that comes with it is also protected. Now, I think in the sense of the role that tech plays, particularly for children and healthcare, this pandemic has changed everything. It has hopefully also revealed what that implies to lawmakers and will hopefully encourage them to rebalance. But I'm not sure. There could also be effect of the charm offensives that we've seen by CEOs in the direction of lawmakers. I wonder what the legacy will be, not only for the individual, as you mentioned, Samir, which I think is very important, but we must also acknowledge the collective handling and analyzing of data. So this is not only a question of individual consent, but rather of societal impact, including how more surveillance, for example, through tracing apps that are mentioned a lot as a solution to the lockdowns, are impacting people's behavior, how they normalize surveillance and control over people, and how they normalize increased use of data for different uses. For example, location data for health purposes, purchasing data for tracing individuals. So I worry that in the name of a crisis, which this pandemic clearly is, there is a pressure to sidestep civil liberties. And unfortunately, we've seen that before after 9/11. And I think we are still recovering from the compromises on civil liberties that have been made back then. And we should not repeat those mistakes.
Before I turn to Mr. Panda to reply to the same question, let me also now reach out to those who are attending this conversation to post their questions on the chat window, and I will be coming to those post one more question that I'm going to pose to both the speakers. And Mr. Panda, how will our relationship change with technology? What do you think are going to be the new textures we will have to manage? And what do you worry about as a lawmaker?
So I agree with her comments that technology has profoundly changed our lives, and it's going to keep on changing as there's going to be more machine learning, more algorithms, more AI, and there's no getting away from that. Now, some basics apply. Samir, you're aware in the position I have espoused, I've said that with consent of both individuals and societies and through regulation by democratically elected governments, we can have a different attitude towards metadata where individual privacy is not compromised, and yet we can get useful data about health pandemics emerging or about terrorist activities from metadata without compromising individual IPs and individual users. Now, it's not just this crisis, but every crisis leads to a centralization. Whether it is a pandemic, whether it is a war, every crisis leads to centralization, and it goes up and down. Now look at these tracing apps. India's tracing app, the Arogya Setu, has become hugely successful, way over 100 million downloads, and that's because it's been required by government. Now, some questions have been raised about it, but stop and think for a moment. Now, every health expert has advocated from the beginning of this pandemic that to contain it, you have to do tracing. Now, we've done physical tracing. In India, you've got an army of health workers on the ground risking their lives, going from door to door to check with people who have had contact with others who have got infected. Now, that's an old-fashioned, crude way of doing tracing. Now, if you do it with an app, then of course it will flag all these other issues. The question is then, do we not do it? Or do we do it and impose strict guidelines with very, very narrow exceptions of what these apps can do? And my inclination is for the latter, because we can't turn the clock back to doing things the way it was done in the 20th or the 19th or the 15th century. Now, to do it in the 21st century, we cannot abjure technology. The question is, how do we protect the basic rights and still make use of this technology? There's no getting away from it.
So last question to both of you before I start taking some questions from the audience. We have plenty of them now. The last question is that the UK has recently proposed the idea of a D10, a club of democracies. Both of you have used the word democracy a few times this afternoon. Is it time now for democracies to shed their reluctance to use this word in the management of the digital sphere? Is it time for democracies to come together and create norms that flow out of democratic societies, where a minimum common level can be agreed to and contextual layers can be added over? Is it time for a D10 to set the digital agenda for the next 80 years that remain in this century? Or will we wait for the Chinese to do it for all of us? And they're good at it, by the way. They are far more efficient. So I think the question before the two lawmakers or former lawmakers, future politicians, that is it time for a digital 10 to come together and build a digital agenda for the future that looks at platform management, that looks at flow of data, that looks at personal protections, that looks at human rights, that looks at prosperity and growth in a manner that is consistent with what we have tried to build in the last 75, 80 years post the war? Marietje, you want to start? Marietje, should I come to you first?
Yes, thank you so much. I've turned off my video because I had some connectivity problems, but I can hear you. And I think it is the key question that must be answered. I don't think we should stop at a D10 or a D20. I believe that all democratic nations must together develop a democratic governance model of technology. Mm-hmm. It has been shocking to see an abdication of that responsibility after decades of pursuing an international rules-based order. To ensure that there are guardrails for anything from trade to human rights to war and peace and international cooperation. And I think indeed, as you mentioned, and I think that's the urgency that we see and that must not be misunderstood or missed, is that the authoritarian kind of governance model that we see coming out of China very ambitiously is stepping into every vacuum that the democracies of this world are leaving. And since ORF is an Indian think tank, I really want to underline the significance of India in this particular question. And I really hope that the European Union, not just individual countries like the UK, but a big transnational organization like the EU, as well as India as a big country that hopefully will continue to be ambitiously democratic, will also step up and ensure that there's democratic governance of new technologies in the broadest sense. So absolutely, I could not think of a more urgent issue.
Mr. Panda?
So this is, to my mind, a no-brainer, because first of all, in the backdrop, there is a larger macro evolution taking place. And authors like Steven Pinker have talked about the spread of democracy, the reduction of violence, which sometimes we don't realize when we just look at the daily news and the day-to-day developments. Now, second point I want to make is a large part of the rules that govern most global engagement today are remnants from the post-World War II era, and a lot of them have lost their relevance. I mean, if you look at the UN, who all are members of its Human Rights Commission, you can see the hypocrisy there. If you look at those who preach about non-proliferation being some of the biggest proliferators, you see the hypocrisy and the lack of transparency there. So these institutions and the rules of engagement need to change to reflect today's realities. And what has happened is China has emerged in an era when these institutions that I talked about and big nations like the US welcomed it, thinking that it would help moderate China's attitude towards the rest of the world. But you've seen, while China has indeed grown, it has not always played by those rules in engaging with the rest of the world. Now, that what is true of a geopolitical nature is also true of technology and of information. So geopolitically, already democracies have been getting closer together, but it's like glaciers shifting, and it's been going on for the past 15 or 20 years, and you see it speeding up a little bit now with democracies working together. And I believe the same thing will happen. So when you talk about a D10 of digital countries among democracies, that's already happening, isn't it? I mean, look at the effect of the GDPR in the EU over the past 5 years, very much discussed in India, some points taken from it, compared with the US, and so on and so forth. Now, the Chinese model is not held up as an icon that is to be emulated. So I think it's only natural that this will proceed further in the same direction.
So, I'm now going to turn to questions that the viewers have posted here. Let me first start with Dikshita Gupta. She asks both of you, how will a tech company trod the thin line between freedom of speech and censorship? And if it does, will it allow governments to take over the management of discourse in the country? Mr. Panda, do you want to reply to that?
Sure. So again, let me reiterate, these issues, scale makes a difference in this. And as I said, if you're a small platform that has a particular view, it doesn't really matter to others. They have other platforms. But when you talk about these gigantic organizations that straddle the globe, I've made this point repeatedly, and I'm making it again because it's important. Now, as my co-panelists and I have repeatedly said, in open societies, in democracies, it is but natural for government to provide the regulations, to provide the level playing field. There's nothing wrong in that. And if government does something wrong, people will push back and those regulations will change. The problem is with governments that are not accountable to the people making those rules and regulations. Now, again, as I've said before, there are going to be differences between governments. Now, our freedom of speech in India, we're the world's largest democracy. We do have freedom of speech, but we have a slight difference, in fact, quite a significant difference from the freedom of speech in the US. Now, in the US, it's limited to, what you can't say is limited, as I said earlier, to things like child porn and trafficking. In India, from the time of our first Prime Minister Nehru, changes were made to the constitution that there are other things that you can't talk about, you can't write about, things that may affect relationship with other countries, and so on and so forth. So the rules are different in different countries. And yes, if you are a very, very large company in any field, whether you're in the oil business or in the technology business, you will need to have compliance costs to comply in different countries. But as long as those countries are, as I said, democratic, I'm much more relaxed about it than those which are not democratic.
Marietje, you want to come in on this?
Well, I think the question should be understood a little further in terms of what tech companies already do to intervene in absolutely free flows of information. Companies like Facebook or Google or YouTube or Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever, they already have curation and ranking and prioritization on the basis of commercial interests. As Mr. Panda said, of course, there are sort of extreme and illegal categories like child pornography that are not allowed, but it is truly the commercial platform's discretion to expand these categories a great deal. For example, breastfeeding is not considered acceptable, even though if you look at the World Health Organization, it is recommended that women breastfeed. Now, this is only one example, but there are many, many more. So I don't think we should think about the status quo as one in which these big social media and tech platforms do not intervene at all, and that only if and when governments, whether they be democratic or non-democratic, guide them or force them to, that they will. In fact, I think that if you truly believe in freedom of expression, you must argue for anchoring terms of use and corporate policies. You must actually ensure that they are as closely aligned to freedom of expression laws as they exist. And so I think the big challenge is that there's a notion among the broader public, and I hear this all the time, that companies will only be restricted by policies or only be steered by policies coming from government, when in fact corporate policies are already having a huge impact and also limiting impact on freedom of expression when taken literally and legally. So I believe that indeed a democratic and rule of law based standards should be leading. I believe that they are a guarantee for the most guaranteed of freedom for people. But until then, it is important to look at what companies are already doing. So transparency and accountability over what they do will be the immediate steps to take and focus to have, short of regulations by governments that would hopefully ensure that free speech is guaranteed and is not privatized or eroded by commercial motives.
So I think you added an important nuance to that conversation around free speech and censorship. We might be facing commercial censorship in any case because of other agendas. I think that's the point you're trying to make. Let me ask Mr. Panda a question that someone from the audience has posed to you, Shantanu Sinha. He says, in fact, he's asking that should individual governments, especially big governments, support alternative national platforms? I'm reminded of the public broadcasting service of the past. Is it time for countries to fund their own national platforms? How do you break the hegemony of some of these private for-profit enterprises that are interfering in national discourses? I think that's a very direct question to both of you.
Well, if you ask President Trump whether his public broadcasting service is doing a good job, you would get a very different answer. But the reality is, we're not just talking about broadcasting here. We are talking about tech platforms. And the era of unfettered globalization is undergoing a change today. And so focus on boosting your own capacities is emerging. You've seen this in the US, you've seen this in India in the Atmanirbhar India campaign. But there's a difference. The difference in India is that the Atmanirbhar India campaign is not a turn back to closing the economy. It is while having an open economy, boosting your own. So yes, indeed. So you will see more and more of that. And certainly in India's case, because of the scale, we, I think, have certain advantages. The so-called India stack is leading to opportunities for taking advantage of the world's largest biometric identification system. We're seeing revolutions in banking. So there is undoubtedly going to emerge size and scale in many of these sectors of the economy. And that will also involve size and scale in the tech platforms. Now, I'll turn the clock back to 15, 20 years ago, when there was India was already doing well in IT services, but it was always a back-end service provider and not what used to be called shrink-wrapped software packages being sold retail in store. I'll use the same analogy. And what is happening today is that India is transforming from being just a back-end provider. Today, you have very large players in whether it is food delivery, whether it is telecoms, whether many, many different sectors. Now, they are achieving global size and global scale. So yes, you will see that happen more and more in large countries. In smaller countries, of course, it will be difficult for them to get that scale, to have national platforms that can have sustainability on a global scale.
Marietje, public platforms built by national governments. Do you think of a EU created Twitter platform, which is GDPR compliant, culturally compliant, that the EU citizens can be satisfied with?
I don't foresee that, but what I do think is important is that there should be conditions for more choice for citizens and consumers, and that there should be stronger preservation of the public interest. So I would like to see a focus and a redefinition, which is actually a process that the EU is starting, of antitrust rules in the digital age. There's a public consultation now, so I think it's going to be a really important exercise to see how antitrust should be updated to preserve the principle, but to apply it more clearly. And there's one trend that your question made, or the audience question made me think of, that I think of as particularly troubling, which is that a lot of public officials, politicians, are sometimes only using commercial platforms like Facebook to stream meetings or conversations. And I think there should always be a choice for citizens to go to a non-commercial platform to hear their representatives, their elected officials, their government leaders when they speak. And this is a responsibility of public officials and institutions themselves, but one where I see a lot of confusion, which I find unacceptable.
So there are a number of questions around data sovereignty, data localization. Is the health crisis going to embolden the demands to localize vital personal information within the boundaries of a country? Where will India stand on this idea, Mr. Panda, post the pandemic? Is data sovereignty and data localization going to become a big issue for your government in, say, 2021, when the parliament starts to meet again?
You know, in the ongoing debate in India about privacy laws, the issue of localization, data localization, has been the biggest issue. It's been, first it was the elephant in the room, and now for last more than a year, it's out in the open, and there are many different views. The reality is there are certain concerns that countries have. And while there is a classical free market consideration that data need not be localized, it should free flow. You have different pushbacks from different sectors of the Indian economy. So I think this issue of localization is not going to get settled anytime in the very near future. There will be encouragements to localize. There will be encouragements, particularly when it comes to national security, when it comes to financial and health data of individual citizens. There are going to be very strict requirements, but there will not be a stoppage of data flow. So what the final shape will be in Indian regulation is something that is still a work in progress. But this will also be shaped by an earlier concept we were discussing about democracies working closer together and having a freer flow of data. Whereas those, and you again gave the example of how China doesn't allow Twitter, but it uses Twitter outside of China for its propaganda objectives. I can't hear you.
I use the term wolf warrior diplomacy on Twitter.
Yes. So, that's obvious. So, if a country, it could be China, it could be anybody else, has totally different rules for their own market, they will not allow these operators. And here they want to take advantage of them. I think other countries will respond by shaping their regulations so that there is a level playing field and that it's not a one-way street. So I think that's the way it'll shape up.
So you have responded to Uday Mehta from Cuts and a few others who wanted to raise this question on localization and privacy policies. Marietje, data localization, data sovereignty. I think data sovereignty is something that is now gaining ground even in the erstwhile liberal world that gave us an open internet. Are you seeing that becoming a real problem?
Well, if you don't want data localization, which I think should not be the path to go, then you need a couple of other preconditions, which is trust through technology, like cybersecurity type trust through regulation, for example, the protection of data and privacy, and trust in the geopolitical sense. I mean, there will obviously be reservations for countries to share data, even if there are technological and regulatory conditions in place, if and when these countries have relations of, adversarial type or lack of trust in the way in which they engage. So, the way in which I see a GDPR, for example, is as a counterweight to data localization, so that the EU can say you are welcome to bring data into our communities and societies and markets, and we can deal with yours on the other end as long as you meet these criteria. So I would like to see more emphasis on the conditions and therefore also the values that we're trying to ensure and the principles like cybersecurity, if we do not want to see data localization, because I think it's equivalent of protectionism and nationalism, and I don't believe that that's a solution, even if we're in a crisis.
Let me ask you both a question around emerging technology, because that's something that a number of people have also posed around AI and autonomous systems. How can any of us as users, and forget about our day jobs, luckily at work from home, everyone is living the same life throughout now. So there is no day job. We are all at home. Our home jobs. If we were to think about the control and the unwritten influence that algorithms have on our lives, are we seeing sufficient scrutiny of algorithms themselves? Do we actually not require regulation of platforms, but regulations for algorithms? I think algorithms need to be far more transparent, debated, and put into the public domain for scrutiny. Algorithm accountability or algorithm neutrality. Do you think that is a concept that we should be chasing rather than looking at just net neutrality or platform neutrality? Because rubbish in, rubbish out. Your algorithms will define how human beings consume, communicate, and experience. Do you think there's a case now for greater partnership to bring an in-design audit of algorithms? Before you put them out into the market, there should be a committee of wise people who are able to understand what the promoters are doing. I mean, just as an example, 12 or 13 years later, we are still discussing how to manage Facebook and other social media platforms. It's already out there. People are already living off it. And yet we don't have a response to governance and regulations of this platform. So shouldn't technology, before it goes to market, be scrutinized? Emerging technology question.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I take that?
Yep, please.
I'm happy to start. I think it's crucially important, and it's a combination of data sets and algorithms and an appreciation of the evolution of these algorithms as well. Because for example, Google search algorithm changes 3,200 times a year. So the experience that you have with Google search algorithm in the morning can be different than what it is in the evening. And so what does that tell you about the ability to hold to account and to apply independent oversight over that company? You need to not only have an accountability and sort of documentation system in place, you also need to think about ex post and ex ante accountability measures. So I think it's a full field that involves the algorithmic application to data, but also the data sets going in, like you said, rubbish in, rubbish out, and sometimes even rubbish on steroids out, because of the amplification of some of the features through algorithmic processing. So I think it's high time for an Algorithmic Accountability Act. And it's interesting because some of my students are providing input to the EU AI white paper, which is closing this weekend. And in fact, an EU Algorithmic Accountability Act is one of their proposals.
Oh, excellent. Mr. Panda.
just one quick point about the earlier question about data localization, and then I'll come to this. We're using Zoom, and as you know, Zoom has its servers in China, and there are organizations and entities that have discomfort with that because Chinese rules are not GDPR, they are not open. So it will definitely have an impact, whether you like it or not. Now, coming to this, AI and machine learning and algorithms are changing so rapidly and ramping up so rapidly that trying to keep up with them is going to be enormously challenging. So I want to focus on something that it's the underlying principles that we must regulate, because trying to regulate algorithms is in my opinion, is going to be a futile chase. So let me give an example. Let's take the insurance industry. The insurance industry is one of the largest users of data technology, and they use algorithms quite a lot. So we have rules and regulations, for example, underlying a principle that, for example, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, or you cannot discriminate on the basis of caste or religion. Now, that's what we must be enforcing. The algorithms can keep changing as many times as they change, as long as they don't violate this basic principle. But if we start chasing individual algorithms to try to regulate them, it's not going to be feasible. It's not practical.
So looking at principles and guidelines that must define the development of the solutions that use algorithms and autonomous systems. Let's see, we look forward to the act that Europe might be considering at some point, and it might be a good idea for India to team up with them in that process so that we have a degree of convergence. I cannot but ask you that important question. It has two sounds, 5G. And I want to ask you about 5G, the future of 5G debates in Europe. Marietje, it was in many parts already a divisive issue. Some countries had embraced it, some countries were extremely skeptical, and some were waiting for it and longing for it. What does that debate look like today, post the pandemic? And Mr. Panda, is India going to use strategic autonomy as a tool to navigate this debate, or are we going to take a stand? Let me first start with Marietje. Are you there, Marietje?
Yes, sorry, I had a little bit of a delay, I think. So I don't think the pandemic has fundamentally changed the 5G debate in Europe. What is the problem that has been exposed by this challenge is the tension between a single market where there's a level playing field and companies are supposed to be able to enter according to the same rules and regulations across the entire European Union on the one hand, and on the other hand, the national competence over national security. So you have 27 or 28 different member state deliberations according to their national security concerns over when, for example, foreign direct investment should be restricted, or the entering onto the market by a certain actor like Huawei, for this example, should be limited, etc., etc. And I think it's been very confronting to the EU to see that there is such a tension between national security on the national level and the aspiration of a single market. So instead of ad hoc measures, which have been opted for now, a so-called toolbox to deal with network equipment and 5G, there should be a structural solution that brings together these different elements of the economy and national security. And I would also argue human rights, because I think in technology, and especially as the technologies evolve, like in 5G, it will become increasingly difficult to differentiate between economic, security, and human rights concerns, and therefore an integral focus of governance, again, bringing it back to the point that you raised around a D10 or a democratic governance model. The EU should really seize this as an opportunity to take the lead in that direction.
Mr. Panda.
So, let's bring this elephant out into the open. The 5G technology wouldn't have any controversy if it came from, say, Estonia, or if it came from certain other countries. The real issue is that it is coming from a country that is itself opaque and has shown in many places that it plays by its own rules. And any transformative technology which can have a tremendously transformative impact around the globe, not just in its own neighborhood, is bound to be looked at not just for the merits of that own technology, of that technology itself, but for who is purveying that technology. Now, let me use another analogy. If you turn the clock back to when nuclear technology was in its infancy. Now, if the Soviet Union would have wanted to put up peaceful nuclear energy plants in 140 countries, the US might have had some concern, and vice versa. So it's exactly the same thing playing out again, that if you have hugely transformative technologies and coming from a source that is opaque and one that has not played by the rules except as it benefits itself, there is bound to be resistance. And so this whole idea of democracies working together with free and open standards again gains more relevance when you talk about these issues.
Mr. Panda, final question to you before I ask Marietje the same question. Are we inevitably, or are we in some sense casually walking into a digital Cold War? Are we seeing the fragmentation of the digital scape? Are we already witnessing it? And is it inevitable that we will have multiple systems with at least two distinct technology, infrastructure and software actors defining these two regions?
Who do you want to go first?
You, sir, and then I'll turn to Marietje.
Okay. Look, there are some commentators who say that there is already a state of Cold War in the world. It's not exactly like the Cold War of 40, 50 years ago. There is much more interconnectivity between the two most dominant economies in the world and the rest of the world.
The Russians have a term for it. They call it hot peace.
Hot peace, okay. But the reality is that things are not as they were at the end of the 20th century. And, this is related to what you asked me a little bit earlier about strategic autonomy. Now, a Cold War-like situation only becomes relevant if countries feel that they need strategic autonomy. If they can have the trust across national boundaries, as my co-panelist was saying, then there wouldn't be an issue, whether it is nuclear energy plants or it is 5G equipment. Now, we have situations in our neighborhood. We've had some skirmishes on our northern borders. What do you think that will egg us on to do? It's a pretty natural conclusion.
No, I think you said a lot today, that what is happening in Ladakh might well be the writing of a file on our 5G position in the future. And I think that's a point that is not lost on many, that trust becomes important for technology, and 5G is not an issue of just another infrastructure, but it is about trust in tech itself. Marietje, Cold War. Is Europe going to be divided?
I think the word Cold War is a little bit confusing because it has such heavy historic connotations, and also because I think we're already seeing a hot war, albeit an invisible war. So I would rather think about the confrontation that we're seeing as an invisible war, with hybrid conflict, with corporate espionage, with disinformation, with the undermining of democratic elections, and with cyber attacks, frankly, happening, but often right below the threshold of war. So I would say it's an invisible conflict rather than a Cold War. Unfortunately, it's much hotter than I wish it was already, and we need to see accountability there. And I think that that's one of the things we need to focus on, that this is not so much a digital problem, but a human problem where real people suffer, and where there's often no price paid by perpetrators. And I think that needs to end.
And I think that's a great note to end this afternoon interaction, this evening interaction. It's digital challenges have real world consequences. People suffer, people benefit. Regulations, governance, policies, therefore, must be designed with this in mind, that they have deep implications for societies, for their progress, for people's needs and aspirations to be met, and certainly for us all to respond to the pandemic that we are currently confronted with. So stay safe, maintain social distance, wear your mask, do everything that local authorities recommend, and please join us again for another conversation that we will be having with special guests very soon. And let me thank Mr. Jay Panda. Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Marietje, Madam Schaake, for joining us from Amsterdam. And see you soon again.